Hi everyone. Don't feel like you have to come on camera at the moment. We can leave that till when we get to more of a discussion bit. Thank you for coming along. And I should probably say thank you so much to Laurie as well for coming along and taking part in this of what is still a kind of evolving experimental format here. We're on to our third so far in this sort of series. And I guess, into the future as well, we've got some really interesting speakers lined up. Just to remind everyone, the format of what we're trying to achieve here is essentially to try and challenge teachers, and particularly geography teachers, in terms of their practice and what they do and how they engage with topics, kind of contemporary topics. And so just to remind people, on YouTube, we've now got a couple of really interesting ones from the London Mining Network and from the Climate Museum UK. So that's a resource definitely for people to pull on. So I was going to throw it over to Laurie, I wanted you to introduce yourself and give you, just before you start, just a little bit of context about the organisation you work for and kind of your role at the moment as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. And hi to everyone who's on the call with us. My name is Laurie. I'm a policy researcher, mainly focusing on how policy and by extension politics should do in response to the environmental crisis. More on that in a minute with some provocations I'm going to make. I work at a range of policy research organisations. One's a couple of think tanks in London, as well as a university department at the University of Exeter. And my work at the moment mainly focuses on the challenge into the future of what the environmental crisis will bring for policymakers and for politicians, and more specifically, the challenge facing emerging leaders of the millennial generation. So I'm at the beginning of my 30s, that kind of age group, who are already emerging leaders, and how they can continue the struggle, the fight to deal with the root cause of the environmental crisis as the conditions globally get worse, something that we've seen sort of portioned into different bits of the globe so far, but will become more of a global hemisphere. And I'm also co-author of a book called Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown, along with Matthew Lawrence, who's the director of Commonwealth. There it is. Excellent. Perfect timing. And Matt is the director of Commonwealth, a think tank that looks at changes to ownership in the economy.
That's something else we're really interested in as well, is that kind of the idea of commoning and shared ownership. But yeah, I was keen to make sure that everyone was reminded of the book. This is something that a lot of us have been reading and been drawing on and trying to reflect on. So hopefully that will feed in. The other one I wanted to just mention as well is that you have been interviewed a few times by Navarra Media and kind of a few other similar media channels. That's another one that we as teachers have been talking about as a source of alternative news, not relying on the traditional media that a lot of people go to. Just kind of what's your feelings about Navarra? And
well, my general view is that the more of a varied media ecology we have in the UK, the better, particularly in the digital sphere. And Navarra is an example of that. I think does a very good job of delving deep into a number of subjects and bringing a different viewpoint that was missing largely from many political debates before. And we need more, both the more capacity within the existing organizations and more particularly local news as well. And we've seen that disappearing in recent decades. And it's so important for grappling with environmental issues because it's hyperlocal as well as global.
Okay, let me throw, I'll let you throw out the provocations that you wanted to.
Okay, so I'm going to explore 3 quick points, and I'm going to do so in less than 10 minutes, and you can quote me on that. The first is we're going to look at a potential pinch point that we've got coming up in the future. The second, I'll talk about overcoming the limitations of the status quo response to the environmental crisis. And then I'm going to finish on a third point around how there's a necessity to develop certain skills, particularly as we go down the generational scale and we face the worsening of the environmental crisis. So the first point around a pinch point. I think you could crudely say, at least in Western countries, that the environmental crisis has been couched very much in terms of a storm sitting over there on the horizon, and we, current generations over here, looking at it and saying, or some of us are saying, if we change course, then as time goes on, we will end up missing that storm and will avoid the horrendous scenarios. Absent the fact that people experience that in different ways and we're not all in one boat, we have now entered the storm and we are going deeper. We would definitely go deeper, even before we had various things going on at COP. And when you're in the storm, you're not just trying to get out of it, you're also dealing with the impacts of the storm, which could militate against your ability or your focus on getting out, right? And my concern is that we are increasingly entering into a bit of a pinch point, which has two sides to it that sort of are closing down on top of us globally, okay? So on one side, let's think about three debts. We have a mitigation debt. So previous leaders have failed to get on top of the environmental crisis by reducing emissions, restoring biodiversity, and stopping the other impacts upon the natural world. There's also increasingly then a removals debt, because the failure to mitigate means that we're going to have to suck huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere in the future and restore nature on an unprecedented scale. And a third debt is the adaptation debt. We're already seeing impacts, and we're already behind the curve when it comes to making sure that countries are resilient, particularly in the global south, right? Now, as time goes on, those three debts will get larger, and eroding our ability to pay them off will be two elements of compounding interest. One is the brute response of the biosphere, the consequences of rising temperatures, the impacts upon the natural world, and so on. And then not just the direct impacts upon societies, more extreme weather, high sea levels, the ones you hear about in the news, but more the cascading impacts. You know, a key food growing region is impacted by more extreme weather and a long run depletion of soils, which leads to food production problems, food price spikes, which then ripple out through the global economy and impact countries that are dependent upon food imports, which are already experiencing political conflict and so on. And as time goes on, as those debts grow and that compounding interest in biosphere response and cascading impacts also increases, it could create this sort of perfect storm of problems that we face, right? And ultimately, we need to avoid runaway changes in the natural world, which scientists are warning us lie closer to us now than we had initially anticipated. They could be closer to the point that we probably overshoot 1.5 degrees than we initially thought. We thought they were much further away. So my concern is that pinch point. The second point, overcoming the limitations of the status quo response, which I would largely characterize as ensuring that market conditions are favorable to swap dirty for clean technologies, for the alternatives, and then to privatize resilience. Now, at least the markets swapping dirty for clean, that is an important part of an overall strategy, but it faces three major issues: consumption, power, and equity, at least in my analysis. So for consumption, bluntly, we don't know, and we suspect that we actually do not have the environmental capacity to absorb a high consumption lifestyle globally. You know, we cannot, electric vehicles are much better than diesel and petrol vehicles, but they come with an environmental cost, not just a carbon cost, a wider environmental cost as well. And the idea that we're going to swap all of the existing cars for electric ones and continue to grow the size of the car economy, as it were, it is a serious risky bet to be betting the planet on. And you can extend that across the wider picture of consumption plus economy. So, and of course, it goes almost without saying that a lot of that consumption lifestyle isn't great for us anyway. So instead of a world pushing us towards, or consumption lifestyle that pushes towards environmental breakdown and prioritizes private affluence, we need a green abundance, a kind of public luxury, and that's what we talk about largely in the book. The second limitation of status quo response is power. Massive power imbalances exist within and between countries across the economy, and they can and must be dismantled by public movements, by the delegitimization of those power imbalances and calling them out, by policy. So for example, changing ownership across the economy, as well as new practice, like, and we talk about this in the book, the idea of community wealth building and other sort of more local ownership models for the economy and for wider society that mean that communities can get on with this and do so in a way where they're also expanding their agency over, in the case of community wealth building, local economies. And the third limitation status quo is around equity. We're already seeing deadly and destabilizing impacts in those countries and impacting those communities who contributed least to this problem. As that goes on, those impacts, those deadly impacts, become globally destabilizing. We cannot insulate ourselves from the cascading impacts of destabilization in other parts of the world, even if we wanted to, and of course, many do. We are as strong as our weakest member globally. That's something that has been said around COVID and the risk of variants happening in countries that don't have access to vaccines. And, you know, I agree with that in theory. We haven't necessarily seen that come to bite in practice. With the environmental crisis, it will definitely be the case. And we're already seeing those kind of rippling effects. So we need greater visibility of those peoples, which is not something the status quo would allow for. A greater idea of a shared us instead of the passing out into thems, institutional change at the international level to make sure that countries and communities in the global south are a part of the decision making and seen and feel a part of the decision making. And then we need to ride the wave of the shifting geopolitics that we see globally, where there is already this process of a shifting power balance across the world. So that's about overcoming the central limitations of status quo, but let's now talk about skills. So if we've got a situation here, mapped on my first 2 points of a worsening outlook, things will get worse before we can even feel that our efforts are making them better. That's what it looks like we're heading into. And we've got this insurgent struggle to try and have deep transformational shifts in our economy, right? My concern is that the former presents profound threats, but also opportunities to the latter, that a more destabilized and destabilizing world, a constantly shifting extreme normal, a no normal, is the backdrop in which we have to win this insurgent campaign for deeper, more systemic change to economies and societies. So we need to develop, and this I think particularly goes to pedagogy, and I would see this sitting, large parts of this sitting within geography specifically. We need to be exploring and developing the kind of skills that people will need to handle that kind of world, right? And I'll give you a few areas to sort of chew over, and maybe we could explore these in more detail in the conversation. We have to understand a broad portfolio of what you could call risk currencies, of people's existing intuition around risk in the world. So let me give you a very crude example of this. Often we say, oh, well, world leaders go to COP and they're thinking about jobs and economic growth. And actually, it's very difficult for them to think in the risk currency of the environmental risks and equity and things like this, right? And that's not to excuse them for doing so. But we need to understand a wide range of risk currencies of a world that's destabilizing and that has impacts upon health, has impacts upon security and defense, has impacts upon equity, and so on and so on. We need to then be able to understand the perspective of other risk currencies to then navigate the people problems in between trying to negotiate through all of those risk currencies, and then to ride that through greater fragmentation and complexity, and to be able to lead under conditions that are so different to what it was like in previous years, and maybe very different to what they're like in the years to come. And those elements of thinking in terms of complex systems and constant change are not at the heart of how we train or allow the training of leaders in governments. And I think we're just not seeing that across the scale through education. And that's exactly 10 minutes. So I'm going to stop myself there, and hopefully we can explore a bit around the pinch point that I described, overcoming the status quo inadequacies. But I would be really interested in your views in particular about the kind of skills we will need in a more environmentally destabilized world as we try to win this struggle for deeper systemic change to respond to it.
Thanks, Laurie. Does anyone want to jump in with any questions that have popped up? Otherwise, I'll feed something in until people start thinking. Feel free to put your questions into the chat as well if you, Dan, jump in.
Hi, Laurie. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. Really sort of nice, succinct overview of where we're at and some of the challenges. One of the things that struck me, I guess, listening to you run through that was some of the language that you use in terms of mainstream economic thought. You talked about compound interests building up over time. You talked about risk currencies was an interesting phrase as well. So I guess I've got lots of questions that might come later on in terms of where we're going, but just in terms of what you were saying and some of the ways it's framed. Is there any sort of logic behind why it is that you chose those particular terms and that particular language that I guess in some ways there's quite a lot of debt to some of the economistic ways of thinking that have got us into the problematic positions that we're in now, in terms of framing where we go moving forwards?
Yeah, and I'm glad you called me out on that, because the first one of a pinch point, I'm playing around at the moment with the appropriate metaphors to use in what will hopefully be quite a high, we'll see what happens, quite a high profile paper that tries to describe that pinch point. And I agree with you that a few of us have been playing around with it. The first metaphor we come to is the idea of debt and then compounding interest eroding your ability to pay off that debt. I actually said in a meeting we had last week, I'm not comfortable with this because it plays too much into the things that we fight on a day-to-day basis, like the credit card analogy of how government spending works and then wider constructs of debt. So if you have an alternative one, I would love it. And that's not me just, I'm genuinely trying to think of a way in which we can describe the dynamics of a huge burden being placed upon the leaders and other, of all generations, but that comes into the future. And then this growing erosion of our ability to deal with that burden. And then on risk currency, that is just a phrase that, or let me put it like this. At the moment, I'm going through a bit of a journey to work out what you could usefully do with emerging leaders of the kind of middle age of the millennial cohort, to better comprehend what a more destabilized future will look like. And that involves talking to people who do sort of immersive scenarios for how to envisage what the future looks like and develop the kind of competencies, or identify the kind of competencies that will be needed as then a basis to development. And they use the phrase risk currencies all the time. And I haven't yet thought of what's a phrase, but what I mean by that is we need to understand that I think we do need to start thinking more in terms of risk. But then as time goes on, we need to understand how risk means something different to different people. The perspective, maybe risk perspective is a better way to put it.
I'm going to jump in there as well, because then where that was leading my thinking was this perception that you were talking about, the idea that we are as strong as the weakest link, that kind of, there is a country out there that actually, if something happens to them, that's going to have an impact on us. But then I think a lot of people, particularly around COVID, this perception that actually we haven't gifted as many vaccines as we initially had said, and that there's this sense that we can look after ourselves, around closing borders as well, and that we'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think it feels like, and the reason why I say feels is because of course we cannot accurately project the future. And in some ways what I'm about to say is based upon a model of what happened in the 2010s, right? And what we sort of fear because of Trump and the so-called reaction to the so-called migrant crisis in the EU. But in the kind of cascading impacts that we're going to see into the future, that we anticipate seeing into the future, and I would refer you all to, and I can share the links for this, a couple of reports that were released by Chatham House in the research organization in London in September It's called a climate change risk assessment. And then in October, it was a paper on near-term threats. And they look primarily at these kind of cascading impacts, like the one I mapped earlier, the sort of breadbasket region gets hit by multiple storms. It then leads to food price rises, which then leads to sort of impacts span the world, right? And it's very difficult. Well, we know from massive expert elicitation processes that these kind of cascading impacts are kind of already here in a kind of muted way, but will get worse as time goes on. And in that scenario, we find ourselves in a bind, right, where we could have a domestic politics, which is very defensive and kind of almost militarizes the response, the sort of the borders being protected, the walls go up, all this kind of stuff. But that could become self-defeating because you can, no country in any world when we're getting a handle on the root cause of the environmental crisis, where we're all cooperatively reducing emissions and restoring the natural world, no country can be an island and protect itself from the growing impacts. But the fear is that the kind of global element of global cooperation begins to be eroded by the overwhelming impacts and the geopolitical consequences of those impacts as time goes on. And we just need mechanisms by which we have stronger global cooperation, which includes trying to dismantle the elements of global power imbalances that kind of crowd out cooperation, right, and have countries compete with each other.
Harry.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks, Laurie. That was one sec. My video doesn't seem to be working. Yeah, can you hear me though?
We can hear.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah. Thanks, Laurie. That was great. So I'm interested as well about the sort of economics perspective you mentioned. So I think you said it needs the right market conditions. So as far as I'm kind of like pulling my hair out with economics at the moment, because I can't see how the market, like the market just seems to exacerbate the consumption. I know it's putting around sort of greener methods, but like you say, they still have an environmental impact. And I kind of see about all the market efficiencies. I can't see how they will help with those three things, consumption, power, and equity. And particularly, I think about intergenerational equity, where I'm at a loss to see how the markets can sort of fix that externality. I wonder, is there any sort of way you can see, have you got something in your mind as to the way that could work?
So I totally hear you on what you're saying, and that's a feeling that I share as well. Never forget that at the moment, or let me put it like this: markets are they are constructs that are underwritten by states, right? So a market in, I don't know, anything, complex financial vehicles, people betting on various things, all the kind of, at the end of the day, they are based upon legal contracts which are enforced by the state, right? For example, and often markets like the market in, I know this phone here, are themselves constructed out of regulation. I think, the state ultimately is the thing that kind of allows markets to exist. In the extreme, right, if there was no state and it was this sort of like anarchic world of different communities and stuff, and we can debate whether the sophisticated markets would exist under those conditions, they probably wouldn't. At the moment, we have allowed us, the powers that be have pushed us into a situation where we flip the truth on its head, and we think markets are sort of natural constructs that exist out of nothing, that if people were left in an anarchic situation, they'd start to trade beaver pelts or whatever, these sort of ridiculous stories of what happened when people went to North America and in the 1700s, and we've left ourselves in this situation where largely the response to the environmental crisis has been to say all that needs to happen is markets just get slightly shunted in the right direction, because when they're really going, they will solve these problems. When suddenly there's a tipping point and the market for electric vehicles gets itself in a position where it's cheaper than diesel and petrol, the sort of magic of how the markets work will mean that suddenly, quite quickly, everyone replaces their petrol and diesel vehicle for an electrical alternative, that kind of stuff, right? There are two problems with that approach, to think that, I think. One is that getting to those tipping points like the tipping point with a smartphone, right? So, you know, there was, in a very short amount of time, suddenly smartphone penetration was ubiquitous after there not being much penetration. You know, this happened in the sort of late 2000s and early 2010s, depending on which we look at it. We haven't got time to sort of allow that to happen, quote unquote, naturally. There needs to be more government intervention to have those tipping points. The second thing, which goes more to the heart of your point, is that even then, that itself will be not sufficient because of things like intergenerational inequity, the fact that all of these things, this consumption lifestyle, comes with massive environmental as well as costs on people, health, equity globally, and all this kind of stuff, right? And that's where we need to remember that the state is the supremely powerful actor, the most supremely powerful actor that human beings have ever been able to construct, sort of pure cooperation expressed through the blunt ability to marshal extraordinary resources, monetary, in terms of people, in terms of materials and things like this. And the reason why I say this is because what we really need is a different model of abundance in which then your markets and other things can potter away in a reasonably managed way to then deliver on that, right? But you cannot skip from one train line, on this one, locked into this one, heading towards disaster at the moment, to a new one, a kind of green and equitably shared abundance, without the kind of brute force ability of the state to pick up the trainer on and move it to a new set of tracks, which itself has started to design. And I just do not think that we're going to be able to get a handle on this until we find ourselves in a situation where massive state investment isn't just trying to change all the stuff we do now to make it a bit cleaner, but actually in a collective, in an equitable way, starts to push us onto a new paradigm for how societies should work, what the point of them is, and what good living standards look like under those conditions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So just feeding off of that, then I guess, I mean, I'm sure this will be something that you're thinking through, but I'm really interested in your thoughts. So geography education doesn't have a very strong tradition of thinking about things like state theory and so on, which obviously is ironic given that academic geography does have quite a long tradition of thinking about that sort of stuff. But the state in school geography, it kind of barely exists. And when it does, it's kind of a peripheral actor, usually acting as a force for good in the world. Which is interesting because obviously a lot of the literature, the thinking, especially the sort of left-leaning literature around states and around the capitalist state, has increasingly been organized around that tension. On the one hand, the argument you're making there, Laurie, which is we have to pressure the state and hope that eventually the state will recognize that it needs to invest and do things differently in order to keep capitalism alive effectively, in order to benefit. Ultimately, it will come to be in the interests of the state to ensure that it invests in this transition. Of course, there's another tradition of writing around the state, which is to say that the state ultimately won't necessarily have our best interests at heart, and that it can't necessarily be sort of captured or engaged with or pressured effectively by the sorts of social movements that maybe have made some of the most effective arguments around climate vulnerability, coloniality of climate disasters and things like that. That's not something that, no matter how much pressure it receives from the left, the capitalist state is ever going to lean towards or engage with. Because I wonder to what extent there's a tension in some of what you're saying there between hopefulness, we kind of hope that effectively the capitalist state will move in a way that we want it to, and the reality, which is that capitalist states have met and gathered together at Conference of the Parties 1, 2, 3, all the way through to 26, and haven't made any effective movement in the right sorts of directions.
Yeah, I strongly agree with you. I think that the idea right now that we will have, in the time required, some kind of interventionist, not necessarily post-capitalist state, but one that is seeking to fundamentally reform the current trajectory of what it means by consumption, of the power balance that it allows in the economy, is exceedingly difficult to conceive as something that is going to happen anytime soon, even with massive civil disorder and other things happening, right? in the face of that sort of stark reality, what do you then do? I think having I take great stock in the potential for more local approaches that use the state as manifested in local institutions, local authorities, the sort of their so-called anchor institutions like local NHS institutions, education, other things like that. I think there is a lot of potential there that really hasn't been realized, to use some of the levers there, obviously, that are weaker, to not just chart a different course of social and economic development at a more local level that has some kind of bearing on the environmental crisis, and this stuff is happening, but also starts to develop a bit of a model, an alternative model through proof of concept that could end up being scaled up regionally, ideally nationally at some point in the not too distant future. But then I'm concerned that all of that faces the pure brute response of a destabilizing biosphere and the cascading consequences that then come from it. That's not to be doom laden to say that it's then impossible, but what we, I think, will see is such extraordinary threats, but also opportunities to that kind of agenda, to any kind of way of looking at this, right? Whether you look at it kind of from a scaling up different approaches to the state from a local level that I just mapped, or a much more radical approach of civil disorder as a way to just either fragment the status quo or flip it, or a kind of eco-primitivism that starts to just say, do you know what, we've got to check out and just carry on as our own more binary communities. There will be huge opportunities and threats to all of those elements as time goes on, right? At the moment, we're almost in, to use, I can't think of a better example here, but like the phony war at the beginning of the Second World War, right? Where we know what's going on, it's about, but the crescendo has not really erupted globally. It is in the global south, but not globally. And being prepared as best as one can with the kind of skills where you can navigate the massive threats and opportunities is so essential, because we should kind of never underestimate how absolutely ill-equipped much of the status quo is for that kind of weirdness and craziness that's coming, as well as make the assumption that others, just by dint of their particular view, like a kind of violent eco-nativism, will also fare very well out of that. And things are going to get pretty wild, and being prepared to sort of jump on the opportunities as well as be defensive in the threats is really important, and presents, I think, more opportunity for change than we necessarily can conceive of right now in this sort of beginnings of the slide towards a more destabilized world. But yeah, none of that is satisfactory, right? Like, this is so complex, so vast, and just grasping onto bits and better preempting how you can further one's particular agenda for change is really important. I think that's kind of my thing at the moment.
Can I throw something in, Dan, before you jump in? The thing that comes to my mind, because I know we want to get on to thinking about what it is that teachers need to be doing, and what is this, you know, that skills bit, and the kind of exploring how we can as schools play a role in this. The thing I want to just reflect on, though, is, you know, Dan saying that the way that teachers often communicate the role of government as some sort of either inert or really good, in a sense. Yeah. There's not much criticism in the sense of the role of governments in geography. But also, is there a problem also the way that then teachers are kind of communicating a lot of what is happening? And also that's to do then maybe with the way that we compartmentalize a lot of this, and the way that we often communicate it as being very natural, and remove that human, you know, any sort of criticism of the role of people within much of this. That actually we are then helping to perpetuate this kind of lack of understanding of what's going on, and a part of that problem of actually, I guess then it feeds into that, the second provocation about just the status quo, and that we are then reinforcing that status quo, you know, and maybe part of that is also then the language that we are using in schools that isn't communicating that sense of urgency and the severity of what we're experiencing.
Yeah, you just have to set this in. It's not a problem that's existed for 5 years, 50 years. It's a 500-year growing problem that's cited back to the beginnings of the development of complex capitalist sort of state industrial complex, you know, globalized, you know, a whole globalized mash of those things. And I think that the understanding the various roles of private actors and the state at phases of that development, of the initial period of exploration and colonization, of then the accelerated rollout of the extraction and exploitation of peoples and places in the 1600s, 1700s, sort of reaching its the sort of growth, overwhelmingly grotesque spectacle of what happened in South America, to then this more formalized industrial empires that then ultimately ended up colonizing all of Africa, and then how that morphed into the sort of hyper growth, great acceleration of then the post-war era. You can almost take those as snapshots of time, and in that understand the scale and urgency of the problem that we're facing, but B, and this is the most important bit, it's how it developed out of the complex interplay between those kind of actors. And in the current moment, that helps you understand the political economy of what we're dealing with here, and that freaks you out because it's just so vast, and you're looking at the development of systems over hundreds of years and actors that are just so entrenched and all of these kind of things. But throughout the history, you also have moments where you can understand the immense power, particularly things like states can muster. And right now, we are going to go through a discontinuity that is nothing like the last 500 years. I mean, it's nothing like the last 5 million in some cases, right? And that presents opportunities, but also threats, the ability to then also push all of the kind of actors in society through discontinuities themselves, and the massive potential that comes with that, right? And there have been so many times, I know this is probably going to sound insufficient in the scale of what we face now, but there have been so many times in the past where different actors, particularly the state and society, it would have been inconceivable to think that they would take certain actions even a year or so before then they engaged in certain types of behaviors. And this, I would love to talk to you guys about the skills bit. And one of the skills for me is in comprehending the kind of things that we just discussed there, it's staying on this kind of saddleback. It's very easy to fall down either side of one side, a kind of hysterical, almost hysterical now optimism, a kind of like one more heave towards market perfection, guys, and we're going to have sorted this. And then on the other side, a kind of an overwhelmed, sometimes misanthropic fatalism, because we're just dealing with the biggest stuff we can possibly comprehend. And living on the sort of juncture between those two things is very difficult, but something that has to sit at the heart of the kind of soft skills that people are really going to have to be able to navigate a lot of what's coming next, I think. But I want to hear more about what does education look like at 1.6 degrees, right? And in which we've torn down we've burned through another fifth of the world's arable land, right? Under those conditions, what does it look like?
So does it have to partly look, and this might, I guess, this might be a little bit different to where we might think this might go, but in some ways, some of it has to look a little bit like it does at the moment, as in a lot of what you're talking about tonight could be taught on the geography curriculum right now, and some of it even is. So feedback mechanisms, tipping points, as you're calling them, they're on the A-level geography curriculum. Concepts around vulnerability, they're often talked about when it comes to hazards. Concept of a multi-hazardous environment is on the A-level geography curriculum, in the sense of thinking about not just earthquakes and volcanoes, but increasingly now climate vulnerabilities, climatic hazards, the role of climate change in amplifying or sort of sharpening some aspects of those things. So that there are elements. I don't think it's necessarily a case of junked a lot of it. It is a question of saying, Well, hang on a minute. Alongside all that stuff, we've also got Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons on the A-level geography curriculum. So we definitely need to junk some stuff. The environmental Kuznets curve is on some specs still. You know, there's some really problematic content in there as well. But there's real potential in some of the areas, I think, and this is where what we're seeing. I mean, I suppose this network's kind of testament to that, in that it's possible for teachers who have been able to be engaged and informed on some of this stuff to be able to teach content that thinks critically around these themes, and that sort of skills students up or engages them in the relevant knowledge base, kind of around the admittedly very problematic framework that we've got. And so maybe it's not just a curriculum change, an education change, it's sort of societal changes around the way that teachers are trained and brought into the profession, as much as it is saying that teaching needs to be done differently, or we need to revise all the specifications. A starting point is how does the state train its teachers? Well, unsurprisingly, the state doesn't train its teachers to be critical thinkers these days, and is increasingly changing initial teacher education to move it away from university bases into employment-based routes. Arguably, that's connected to, or at least one risk of that is that teachers are less likely to engage with critical thought and literatures around the kind of ideas that we're talking about tonight in the process of entering the classroom, which then obviously does limit their abilities to engage with these ideas in classroom contexts.
Can we let Bob jump in?
Yeah, hi. I'm a bit out of my depth with. I'll put my video on. Hi. Yeah, I'm not. I'm not as educated as you guys. I do volunteer work in primary schools on eco projects, and I'm very interested. The hook for me to come tonight was what's the progress on the education side. I did see that there was an article. Nadine Zawawi he's going to set out plans to promote action against climate change in schools, and he's going to introduce some Duke of Edinburgh Award type schemes into classrooms, and primary level is the start. You know, I find that year 6 you can really engage with year 6. They can pick it up really well. I've done projects with them last week about how things are going to go, you know, talking about deforestation and get deforestation off our plates, basically, was the slogan that we chose. And they really engage, but once they go to secondary school, they get swallowed up with academia, and they'll Paul know, and Daniel know about that, how there isn't enough time for them to do that. In that article, it's a test.com. I can send you put the link on if you want. And it just goes through. It has a little video about, you know, how frustrating it is for teachers trying to do things. And I think the action that they're talking about, our government, I think we're doing really well here when you consider the situation with what China and India did to the meeting, how they sort of dictated the way it went and the outcome. We're doing really well. We need to get behind the government and lobby hard to make this year really count, and that getting education, getting it onto the curriculum is absolutely vital. I'll post the link to that, Laurie.
That's great. Yeah, thanks.
But what's it going to look like at 1.6? I think you only need to look at the border of Poland and Belarus. You know, that's it. You've got refugees being pulled around the place, and it's going to be climate refugees, and they're going to be building walls, and it's going to be a nightmare.
And can I just ask that, Bob, did you, with your year 6s, say things like Fridays for the Future, is that something that they've all wanted to get involved with? Have they gone on some of the strikes, and is that something no,
we're not doing that. We're doing it in the classroom. We're doing things. We're making videos about what they've learnt, and then we're getting them getting to the MP, and there's a couple of schools have got questions put into the Commons. So it's raising the level, and because the activism is okay, but they all tend to get tied by the same brush. You know, you have Insulate Britain being there, and I tried to organise something for Friends of the Earth on the Cumbria Coal, but they wouldn't do it. Well, no, it was the local diocese. I wanted them to sort of get involved, the local bishop, and to make a statement, but they wouldn't do it because of what Insulate Britain are doing, by making that point and causing all the disruption. And Friends of the Earth they're one of the players in the Cumbria Coal debate, and they've done an awful lot of good there, but it gets that all tied by the same brush, which is very difficult. So to do something from the classroom and do it within the school, and I think there's more potential for that. There was some alternative COPs done last year, I think, wasn't there, in some of the schools.
Mock COP, yeah, there's mock COPs, interclimate or intraclimate, yeah. The one of my concerns about like the DFE proposals is that it's climate change within a very narrow framework. It's dictated within the government's bounds of what they perceive to be safe, and there's a very, from my perception, I think it's quite a narrow political band in that sense, and it's sort of appeasement to some extent, or you know, that's my kind of sense of it, is that they feel like they're doing enough, but in the big grand scheme of things, actually the impact of that. So it's kind of playing with individual actors to then make them feel like they're doing something.
Do you get any engagement with them, Paul, and with the government, the teaching federation, with the government about getting it onto the curriculum?
I've heard that there's within the DFE, there is a sustainability, there are people with that as a responsibility and roles. But this is my other question, maybe to Laurie as well, is that sense of these changes seem to be quite slow paced and really incremental. Changes in education take years to be reviewed and then to be implemented and all this sort of thing, that this pace of change, you know, both within broader society but also within education, just feels like it's not fast enough.
I think in the same way that you can apply, there are tipping points everywhere, right? They're hiding away natural systems that could lead us down the road to disaster. Some of them exist in economic systems that we could use for good if they're stimulated properly by states and others, right? I think tipping points also exist in more sort of social tipping points, and it's so difficult to, and I'm not usually the person making this argument, but I think it has to be made. It's so difficult to conceive of a social tipping point happen. And by a social tipping point, I mean, you know, big cultural change, big demand, the social movements emerging and making certain narratives just become mainstream. And all of these kind of cascading elements happen where the unimaginable then becomes increasingly the politically palpable or whatever, right? And it was very difficult running around in policy land, Westminster and stuff back in 2018 to even get people to admit that we should probably talk about how bad this is, the environmental crisis, right? And things like Extinction Rebellion almost overnight flipped the ability to make this kind of arguments. And for me, it was inconceivable to imagine a world kind of like we are in now, with the kind of political arguments in the mainstream, however much many of them are insincere, that would happen within, I mean, it was 3 years ago that we had a number of big changes that, you know, Greta Thunberg had pretty much just started school striking. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest congressperson ever elected, was elected and started talking about Green New Deal. Extinction Rebellion had their first action, you know, George Monmouth got arrested, no one cared or whatever. But we know within the space of a few months, things just sort of erupted. And education is not my speciality, right? But we have to be constantly thinking about all the different ways that we can contribute towards making big, particularly social tipping points. And things come along that have just lots of people have worked on, that maybe at times they thought were useless, or other people were useless, things like rebellion that have contributed to sort of little tipping points all over the place. And never underestimate how you can be pushing away at something and it can lead to a tipping point. And the necessity for people to be talking openly and in an increasingly high profile way about how the training of teachers, then actually the education that's offered to people is just completely insufficient and does not fit with the non-incrementalism that has to be characterizing the current times we live in. That has to happen. That has to be a part of that kind of tipping point moment. Now, I don't know specifically how you do that within the kind of context of where education campaigning exists and that kind of stuff, but you know, it has to be a part of it. And there are certain, I'm going to post this in the chat, this is a game that might be useful that you guys could consider. It's called Daybreak. Have any of you ever played Pandemic? It's a cooperative game about dealing with a global pandemic. I'm working with the amazing guys who are making this about the environmental crisis. And it is a highly absorbing way in which you can offer to people of any age a really immersive way to learn about the kind of difficulties that we find ourselves in, the trade-offs that then come from it. And I've been in groups of people who play that game, and that in itself has been a sort of personal tipping point that people experience, you know. Sorry, that's just an additional point to what I was saying.
Can I throw something out to Dan as well? Because it feeds in with what you're saying there. Is for me, what Dan is proposing in the sense of, there's things within the framework of the current education system that we can just kind of shift and influence a little bit, and we don't need to change things too radically. For me, just isn't enough. I feel that there needs to be a holistic shift in education, and partly with this idea of maybe there's such a focus on terminal examination competition to then get jobs, and this idea about work as a kind of a very odd idea of people's roles within society, and feeding into that, you know, these ideas of capitalism. But then the opportunity for schools to radically show an alternative, to be part of a community, that then there is shared ownership, and that actually the way that we educate people is completely flipped on its head, where people are going out engaging in society and learning in a different way, and then society learns from young people. Whereas now we very much compartmentalize, take students into a classroom that is then almost often seen as something separate from the rest of society, and that maybe feeds in this idea about this unease of young people engaging in political activity, because there's this sense that they shouldn't be, you know, because they're not part of society yet, and then there's that kind of complex nature of then how teachers are kind of seen as being politically neutral. But then, you know, we as a group have talked a lot about the idea that actually the act of teaching is heavily politicized, and actually if you don't realize that, you're actually then just perpetuating the status quo if you're not yourself kind of conscious of that.
Do you with your students, do you get the feeling that there's a high demand, that they are political? There's a high demand within them? Because, you know, the story that's told in kind of political circles, particularly in London, right, sort of like the kids are ready to go, you know, they're agitating all over the place, you know, everywhere. There's a kid around the corner sort of scribbling a Fridays for the Future banner, and and that's why they're gonna save us. You know, you get all these sort of people who are in their mid-50s at COPs and stuff, who are kind of have been on the block for a very long time in policy world, and they're all sort of, oh God, it's really bad, the kids are going to save them, that kind of stuff. Is there that kind of demand coming at you, that you have students in the classroom who are massively politically engaged, who are saying, you know, and I sort of had this when I was at university, and it's a different level, but in the education system, but I was there during the financial crisis, you'd be reading about this sort of explosion of the world going on outside, and then you'd go into the classroom and it would just be learning, and I was learning about economics. There was just nothing about actually what was happening in the real world. Do you have that kind of demand from the students who are just like, the world is on fire and I'm fired up, And now I'm coming to the classroom and I'm demanding that of you, teacher, to talk about this.
I have a response to that, but I'm keen to hear other people first. Dan or Harry? Yeah, or Bob?
Yeah, I can go if that's okay. Yeah, well, I think the kids are fired up. Generally, my kids, I find they hate injustice. So I think when you frame climate change as through justice and equity, I think they definitely feel for that. But I'm also conscious. It's like Paul said, where you're kind of supposed to be politically neutral. So I try not and let them. It's hard. It's a hard one to think. I don't want to be up there, like an evangelist preaching to them. I want to kind of show them, and very critically what's happening. But I also find they don't like being preached to. I have a lot of students who, if they get whiff that you're a vegan or a vegetarian, they don't like it. They're automatic, and they think you're going to try and convert them. It's really funny. So I don't let them. I try not and let them, because you want to be passionate, but equally, you don't want to be evangelical, and you want to be, critical. And I mean, the biggest thing for me, pedagogically, is I think they need to be. I always trying to show them importance to being like critical consumers of news, And it's funny, like Bob mentioned about the, China and India sort of being not so good at, on the outcome of COP. I mean, I'm most disappointed with the developed countries, but I totally take what Bob said, because I think if you read most of our press, you would think India and China had let everyone down, and we'd been great, and the US had been great. And I just sort of think, well, that's not, for my mind, that's not a fair account of what's going on. So with regard to the classroom, I think preaching to them, they sort that can sometimes get their backs up a bit. But equally, they hate injustice, and if you can frame it that way, that I think that's a good seller for them.
Harry, can I flip that on its head as well, though, and say that that's the system making you feel uncomfortable? So because of the current societal expectations, you feel like you can't do that, but we need people to feel confident to do that and challenge those things. So it's almost like there's like checks within the current system which stop people from going too far beyond the boundaries, and they keep you within that kind of tight control. That then means, you as a teacher feel uncomfortable doing that. I can quite easily imagine a point in the future where actually it's the other way around, where, a teacher who mentions, driving a car or actually eating meat is then seen as the one who's the kind of odd one out. And, what we need to do is push things within our own spheres so that then actually that dynamic shifts and change.
No, I totally take that point. I guess in my head as well, it's that whole, where I think if you get a bit too evangelical with them, that's where I feel like sometimes they can kind of, I don't know, it can almost sometimes put them off a bit if they think, I don't know, that's just my feeling, but I know I totally take that point.
Do you guys teach around how there have been, I guess this is much more cited in human geography, I guess, how there have been periods of intense struggle all the time in history, and there are certain movements of people that are outside of the mainstream that contest, that then end up winning the hearts and minds of more of a majority of people, often who don't hold much power, and that has led to changes in the past, not in a prescriptive way, but in a way almost to just explain the current moment, the sort of ferment that you see, including with school kids going and striking, stuff like that. And cited within that is a sort of a bit of a, sets people on a trajectory where they can learn some of the toolkit themselves. I'll post this in the chat here. This is a research report that I just got published today, actually, that I was lead author on, which kind of looked at social movements. It quite in the near term, it looked at the kind of movement that has pressured the Tory party on the environmental crisis, looked at the LGBTQ plus movement since the 1980s, race relations and the fight against systemic racism since the 60s, and then also health inequalities, and tried to learn some of the lessons from those movements, things they did well, things they didn't do so well. And once you sort of get absorbed in an understanding that people who now, like those movements now, they're kind of mainstream, right? But in the past, they were absolutely not. And they were seen as disgraceful and as oppositional to the system in a violently unacceptable way. And being exposed to the fact that people that we now talk about often, you know, sort of which people like Gandhi and stuff are sort of at the apex of, were once like violently opposed by the media, by the state, by other things. It's just a really interesting way to sort of enter a kind of a critical mindset in which we're able to explore what resistance looks like and what struggle looks like in a kind of wider, you know, in wider society, without having to be prescriptive and say, hey, I'm a vegan. Have you thought about that, guys, you know?
Jump in, Dan, jump in.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, Laurie. I think that's my kind of preferred go-to way of approaching some of this stuff. So we've been working on a project locally in Halifax looking at the year 1842 and the Chartist movement and the Great Strike of that year, and thinking about that environmentally, climate-wise, thinking it in terms of different aspects of social movement struggle, who was involved in those struggles, who's engaged in them, and trying to get students to look at Chartism in the way it's depicted in textbooks now, where it's very much a sort of British values narrative of progress towards democracy and inevitable changes that were going to happen anyway, and hasn't it all ended happily, and we've all got most of the rights that were in the original charter, except some of them, yearly parliaments and things like that aren't there. But I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because it then becomes cross-curricular in the sense that you can look at some of those social movement struggles over time in history lessons, in geography lessons, in religious studies lessons, in you know, your sort of citizenship and PSHE lessons, and you look at similar thematics, and I guess that comes back to what you were saying earlier about what skill sets the students need for this. Yeah. They need the skill sets to be able to understand and evaluate and assess movements over time, and to understand really how social change happens, and how they can be actors and agents within social change. I don't know if they see that, if we tell them what they should be doing or thinking. I'm not sure if that always necessarily is an effective way to get young people to see themselves as agents of social change, to be sort of moved to action by teachers effectively sort of instructing them in how to act. I do think there needs to be an openness to advocating, or at least not closing down certain lines of action. I think that's where maybe Paul's coming from. Teachers too often close down certain ways of acting and being and doing by saying that, oh no, you shouldn't join these climate strikes, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But I'm not sure equally that saying you should act like this is always the right way to go, when actually, yeah, I think that sort of critical engagement with the reality of social movement struggles at the time is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, this is how others acted in similar situations.
There's almost like a toolkit for social change, or to engage. It's not even just to change society, but it's to engage with society that young people need to be equipped with, that often is omitted. The thing I think is often interesting as well is that we rewrite the stories of past, you know, the suffrage is another good example of that, where within schools we teach it in a really clinical sense, where we now say, yeah, what these people did was really good, but like you're saying, is at the time it was discouraged. But I think the mainstream, though, mainstream in terms of teaching, reflects sort of mainstream media in the sense that actually most teachers see these people as a nuisance, and that's how it's communicated in the classroom, and they sort of agree with this idea that actually they're not doing anything good, and that then feeds into this dynamic of saying to young people that they shouldn't go and protest or strike, and that isn't a useful tool. And again, that reinforces the idea that then you just need to be in the status quo.
Yeah, I'm with Dan as well. Actually, I've got to go as well and get some dinner. But I just quickly on that, I don't know if you guys are seeing this with the students. I definitely remember experiencing this as a student. I'm you know, that was what, like, well over a decade ago now, in a low-income community, and going into lessons and them jarring against what I was reading on Reddit and other things, right? And I know this might be a niche concern, but kind of almost, in my experience, almost all of the insidious stuff that we fear is being pumped into people's minds by engaging in social media is often revisionist in its history, right? You know, this is what you're told, actually it was like this, of which the sort of pure extreme is you're told about this scientific consensus, you're told about this group of people, you know, and it's not true. And a lot of this has to be about catching up with the desire for that kind of revisionism, but doing it in a managed and accurate way, lest people then end up in the holes of social media and getting a much darker version of that revisionism, you know.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you for that link as well, because that game, you know, I'm sure that'll be a useful tool for teachers. So that's something we'll share.
Yes, that's good. And then look at that report as well. It's not dry. It's presented in quite a nice way, and it goes through sort of stages of various lessons that it's really useful for people to have in their mind about how social movements have worked in the past.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
It's yeah, good to chat to you guys. Thanks so much for having me. And you know, reach out, and if there's anything I can do to help in whatever small way, do let me know, because I'm a real believer in what you guys are doing, and I've read your manifesto and I strongly agree with all of it. So it's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks guys. Take care.